of her book project, which I'll talk about in just a minute, in a contemporary art gallery in Los Angeles. And that's all, you know, a development of her having gone back to Tijuana and being based there and doing a project there. One thing that I really appreciated about the artists there is that they really use the material of that place. And there's a lot of material to be used, obviously, because there are a lot of social issues that come out of its unique position as the heaviest border crossing in the world. And that brings up something else, which is that teaching all these international students, they come to New York and they do this year at ICP, and then they're given 1 year to work in the US as a result of that, which most of them do. They assist other photographers, they work in labs, they work in galleries, mostly they assist. And then they have a taste of that and they don't want to leave, they want to stay. Because, whatever reason, because it's a big city with a lot going on and they get used to it and they become addicted to it even, and they don't want to go back where they're from. And my advice is always go back as soon as you can. Because New York is not a good place to start a career. It's a great place for an education, but it's not. It's too tough. There are too many people, it's too competitive to get started. And you're better off going back where you have support and you have family and you have people that you grew up with who are well placed and can help you. Go back and do that, become a big fish in a little pond maybe, and then come to New York with some credentials. Go back and forth if you can. And Yvonne is a good example of somebody who did that. She did that year, she actually stayed a little bit longer, she got really good professional experience, and then she came back to Mexico. And even though she had the gallery exhibition in Los Angeles and the book that came out, she's decided to be based in Mexico City now, which is fairly new for her because she's really spent, you know, most of her time in Mexico and Tijuana. Let's see. Now we're into this, where her project went after the thing about her schoolmates and the way they were, you know, basically what that project is about, how they're conditioning their children to continue this sort of lifestyle. She decided to concentrate on one of these women. It was the woman who was married to the former mayor of Tijuana, what's his first name, but Hank, Mr. Hank, whatever his first name is, who has been Jorge, indicted, I understand, whatever, is he in prison? I don't know. Anyway, he was, at the time that she started this project, he was the former mayor and he was living in this very kind of bubble universe where they had everything they needed in this compound. They had their own zoo, they had their own stadium. It was a lavish lifestyle, and Yvonne was allowed into it because his wife, Elvia, what's her name? Maria Elvia de Hank, had studied art history, and somehow she had this appreciation of what Yvonne might do. Even, it's really interesting to think about that. Even, you know, maybe it's a bit of narcissism, but I also feel like there's some recognition of what Yvonne was trying to do as an artist. But when Yvonne published a book of this work last year, she had to let Maria Elvia look through all the images and agree to let her use them, and there are very few that she vetoed. In other words, she had veto power, but ones that she wanted to veto that Yvonne really believed in, she fought for, and ultimately got to keep in the book. She lectured in New York last month, and it was one of the best lectures in photography I've ever heard, because what she was able to talk about in her work were all the issues that photographers never talk about, which is the negotiation of the social space that has to happen for pictures like this to get made. Like how, when you're in these situations, are you the photographer or are you the guest? If you grew up with people and you run into people that you knew socially, and they all know you because your father photographed their wedding, and so on and so on, how do you deal with that, of being the person and being the photographer with a critical eye, but you have to be careful about that critical eye and how you reveal it, because then you might be disallowed from doing any further work. It was a very complicated and tricky position that she put herself into. And I remember being in a workshop with her in Tijuana talking about why this project, why did she have to do this project, why did her work go in this direction into this exclusive celebrity world. And then it occurred to me, of course, because she's been dealing with her sister's celebrity for all these years. And she herself has been in and out and in and out of her own kind of unreal artificial bubble of celebrityhood. If she comes out of a restaurant, the paparazzi might be there because they thought she was Julieta. And if she wants to go out and work as a street photographer into some context of social space in Mexico City, she's going to be stopped by the people's recognition of her or thinking that they recognize her, et cetera, et cetera. And so dealing with this private universe, I think, was a way of dealing with the implications of that in her sister's lifestyle. But at the same time, interestingly, most of the people's identification of her or with her was through her father, and their knowing him as their personal photographer or the town's studio photographer. And I loved hearing her talk about all of this. She didn't miss a beat. She's the most engaging speaker. And I also, thinking about her education and where that comes from, is that I really think that that's a result of getting an MFA at a point when you know how to photograph and you've chosen a great subject, and she was in the midst of that subject, and she had 2 years to talk about it, to explain it, to defend it, to bring up the obstacles and the difficulties and have them challenged and have them assessed, and all of that occurred in that graduate program. So I teach in a graduate program at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. And I think a lot about, there's been a lot of discussion this year about the costs of graduate MFA education in the US, because a lot of the schools that are best known for their photo programs are private, with an average cost of $30,000 to $35,000 a year just for the tuition. And it's exorbitant, and it's unfair, and it's unnecessary, and it's out of proportion to inflation. The costs of private education in the US have increased 3 times as much as inflation over the last 30 years. And I don't know why. Because the money is not going to the teachers, and often the benefits are not being directed back to the students, either in promoting them as alumni or even in the facilities that they get. My students at Pratt are constantly complaining about the costs and what they're getting for that in terms of facilities, and how dysfunctional the school is, and yet they're paying so much. And it's a general question that's being asked a lot, especially with the emphasis this year on the growing income disparity in the US, with the Occupy Wall Street movement and all of this talk about the top 1% and all of their privilege versus everybody else. And so, teaching in an expensive private MFA program like that, I'm very, very conscious of the debt that students are taking on for this experience. And I'm very happy to engage with alternatives of, you know, and the whole question of, do you have to have an MFA? For what? Well, I think most people used to say for teaching, but then it's ridiculous to talk about doing that for teaching when there's so many people going into that market and there are not that many positions for teachers. So then it became, oh, you needed to do it if you wanted to have a gallery career, because it would be all the connections that you made as a graduate student with your fellow students that would help you succeed as an artist in that also highly competitive system. But then so few people make it in a way that they can live from, that's also ridiculous as a justification. So then it's like, okay, is what you're going to learn and that enrichment and further sophistication in your work going to be worth $100,000? And if you have that $100,000 to spend, could you spend it more wisely in a way that might get you the same benefit? So the two examples I've given already who got their MFAs, got them at public universities that were inexpensive relatively, which was a very wise decision, in my opinion. And that's what I would encourage people to do. But the one good public MFA program in New York City is extremely competitive now because everyone realizes that's the cheap alternative, and it has now, it's Hunter College, which is part of the city university system. And they have 80 MFA students a year and 800 applicants. So it's also become extremely competitive and hard to get into, but now I want to show you two photographers who did not do that. But this one, who's Brazilian, but did do what Ivan did, which is to go back to his own culture right after getting his education in New York, which I think was a great benefit to him, and I'm going to show you how. So Mauro Restifi grew up in Sao Paulo, and he lives there today. And he studied at ICP in the same year as Alex Morel. And I guess the big sign of that is that he's still working in 35mm black and white using this classic documentary language of photography in a somewhat conceptual way. What I'm showing you now is the first series of his that really launched him as an international artist. Of all these four photographers I'm showing you, he is the one most well situated in the art market. He shows with the best gallery in Brazil. He's in the collection of the Tate Modern in London. He has many European collections. His work, even though it's from 35mm negatives, is presented very large scale, 40 by 60 inches. It sells for $20,000 a photograph. He lives from this work, and he's about 40. And you know, he's one of a handful of the students I've had in the last 15 years who actually managed to get to that position. I see him a lot, we're really close friends, so I know a lot about his thinking and his strategy. He did this series, he did, well let's see, let me talk about his trajectory. While he was a student at ICP, he was really good in the classroom. His comments were great, he was sensitive, I knew that he was smart, I believed in him, but he didn't actually produce. So sometimes the people who